So how do you overcome a person's suppression of truth and desire to not believe in God? Natural theology cannot get them there fully. What natural theology can do, it can show the illogical inconsistencies in their own thinking and deconstruct their arguments, but it cannot get them to come to God willfully. So what is natural theology? So natural theology is to attempt to build a theological framework or structure based on general revelation apart from special revelation. So this is an attempt to understand God through general revelation and not special revelation. So this is how you get into a lot of these apologetics or philosophical arguments to prove God. Now, there's a spectrum on these things. Some Christians think that natural theology is very useful and helpful. Some Christians believe that it actually can be sufficient to get people to believe in God, while some Christians believe this is completely unhelpful. So there's a spectrum. So as I introduce these arguments for natural theology, whether you want to use it or not, it's up to you. Some Christians like to use these arguments, some Christians don't. But what we do agree on is that at some point, a person has to get to special revelation, but these natural theological arguments can help people get to that point for some Christians. The cosmological argument, right? It's the uncaused cause. If you keep going back from now to the beginning of time, at some point there has to be the first uncaused cause. You cannot go infinitely into the past. Something had to be an uncreated being in the beginning to start this chain of events. Because if that thing was created, then who created that created? Who created, right? You just keep going back and back and back. You got to have a first uncaused cause. That's cosmological argument. The teleological argument is what we call intelligent design. This is when you look at creation and you see a design to all these things. And it's kind of like if you walk in the forest and you see a designed, finely tuned designed Rolex, you don't conclude that it just flew together and somehow, right? It's just random chance of billions of years of all these pieces somehow just came together and became a functioning watch. And that's this argument saying if you actually look at creation, if you look at your bodies, if you look at your eyes, if you look at everything, at some point you see there has to be a designer. Because just by probability, it's impossible that these things come together and just functions and happens this way. So that would be the argument for intelligent design. Third is ontological argument. This is proving God through rational deduction. By definition, God is a being who has every perfection, right? If there is a God, he must be a God that has every perfection, because if he doesn't have every perfection, he's not a perfect being. If he's not a perfect being, he's not God. So the first point of this argument is that if we assume there is a God, he must be perfect, right? Let's do some rational deduction. One of the traits of being perfect is that you must exist. You cannot be perfect unless you exist. Therefore, God exists. If there is a God, he has to be perfect, because if he's not perfect, he's not God. And one of the traits of being perfect is you have to exist. Therefore, God exists. That's an ontological argument. Moral argument, this is from Thomas Aquinas and C.S. Lewis later on. The moral argument claims that there's a spectrum among people who consider things to be good. This is kind of what we went back to morality. Even though we don't agree on everything the same way, we all agree there's some things that are good and some things that are bad. We all have our own spectrum. And we all have different degrees, quote unquote, of goodness. But in order for us to claim that there are degrees of goodness, what does that presume? There has to be an absolute standard to compare that to say that there are degrees in spectrum of goodness. Do you see what C.S. Lewis and Aquinas are saying? You cannot say that there are degrees of goodness without a standard to compare everyone's goodness as saying that they fall on the spectrum. So in other words, we cannot say a sociopath is lower on the degree of goodness than Mother Teresa unless there's actually an absolute standard. But that absolute standard of goodness must be God, because he is the only one who has maximum goodness. That's a moral argument. If there is no God, that there will be no standard to compare everyone's goodness to. So we cannot say some people are better than others apart from an absolute standard which requires God. Pascal's wager from Blaise Pascal, you guys might have heard this. If you look through the natural, logical outcomes that are possible, the only rational choice is to believe that God exists, because you have nothing to lose by believing that God exists, but you have everything to gain by believing that God exists. But you have everything to lose if you don't believe God exists, and nothing to gain if you don't believe God exists. Therefore, the most logical choice, if you want to hedge your bets, is believe in God. That's Pascal's wager. You guys kind of heard that one, right? Anyways, so here's the thing with all the natural theology. You kind of recognize they all have limitations, obviously. Because even if they're convincing logically and you could use them in an argument, as I've been mentioning, a person's unbelief is not primarily a knowledge issue or evidence issue. It's a heart issue. So how do you overcome a person's suppression of truth and desire to not believe in God? Natural theology cannot get them there fully. What natural theology can do, it can show the illogical inconsistencies in their own thinking and deconstruct their arguments, but it cannot get them to come to God willfully. So it's important to know these arguments that you can use with unbelievers, but just know that these arguments alone cannot get them to God or to Christ apart from evangelism at some point. But it can defend your beliefs and show the reasonableness to why Christians believe what they believe. That's what apologetics is. It's supposed to be a defensive mechanism, not an offensive thing. You don't get apologetic arguments and start attacking people. You look at the 1 Peter passage where apologetics come from, is to give a defense for what you believe. So this is a defense thing where they're like, it's illogical to believe that God is this. Or if a God is all powerful, all good, he shouldn't allow this. Okay, let's go through some logic, right? That's what it's for. It's a defense for why we believe what we believe, but it's not an offensive weapon to get people to believe what we believe. So we just got to know where natural theology, how to place that in it.